The winter of 1945 pressed down on Germany like an iron fist. In the ruins of what was once the proud city of Frankfurt, among the shattered buildings and the acrid smell of smoke that never seemed to fade, a 10-year-old boy named Klaus Müller crouched in the shadows of a collapsed apartment building. His stomach twisted with a hunger so profound it had become his constant companion, a gnawing beast that never slept. Klaus had not seen his father in 3 years. Herr Müller had been conscripted in 1942, sent to the Eastern Front, and had simply vanished into that vast, frozen hell. His mother, Frau Müller, had died during an Allied bombing raid 6 months ago. Klaus had watched the building collapse, had screamed her name until his voice gave out, had clawed at the rubble with his small hands until they bled. But she was gone. Now Klaus was alone. Truly, terrifyingly alone. The American forces had rolled into Frankfurt in late March of 1945, bringing with them their tanks, their supplies, and most importantly, to Klaus, their food. The boy had learned quickly where the Americans established their bases, where they stored their rations, where their kitchens operated. He had become a shadow, a ghost moving through the devastated streets, stealing whatever he could to survive another day. On this particular morning, April 14, 1945, Klaus watched the American base from his hiding spot behind a pile of rubble. The base had been set up in what remained of a former German military compound on the outskirts of the city. Soldiers moved with purpose across the muddy ground, and Klaus could smell it. That intoxicating, maddening smell of cooking food. Real food, eggs, bacon, fresh bread. His mouth watered uncontrollably. Klaus had not eaten in 2 days. The last thing in his stomach had been a half-rotten potato he had found in the cellar of a bombed-out house. He could not wait any longer. He had to take the risk. The boy waited until the early morning shift change, a moment he had observed for 3 days now. There was always a brief period of confusion, a gap of perhaps 5 minutes when the guards rotated positions. This was his window. Klaus moved like a cat, staying low, his worn shoes making no sound on the broken pavement. He had gotten good at this, at being invisible. The war had taught him that. He slipped through a gap in the wire fence that he had discovered days before, squeezed his thin frame through, and suddenly he was inside. The kitchen tent stood before him, canvas walls rippling slightly in the cold April wind. Klaus could hear voices inside, American voices speaking in that strange, musical language he could not understand. But he understood the clatter of pots, the sizzle of food cooking. That was a universal language. He crept to the back of the tent, found a flap that was not properly secured, and slipped inside. The warmth hit him first, a wall of blessed heat that made him dizzy after so many months in the cold. Then the food, tables covered with food, trays of fresh bread, containers of butter, eggs, actual eggs, strips of bacon cooling on metal sheets. Klaus did not think. He could not afford to think. He grabbed. A loaf of bread went under his jacket. His small hands snatched strips of bacon, shoving them into his pockets. He reached for a tin of something, anything, and that was when he heard it. A voice. Deep. American. Well, I'll be damned. Klaus froze, every muscle in his body locked. He turned slowly, and there, standing in the entrance to the tent, was an American soldier. The man was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could snap Klaus in half. He wore the uniform of a sergeant, and his face was weathered, lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from seeing too much death. The soldier's name was James Parker. Sergeant James Parker of the 3rd Armored Division, from a small town in Indiana called Greencastle. He was 32 years old, had been fighting since North Africa in 1942, and had seen more horror than any man should have to witness in 10 lifetimes. And now he stared at a terrified German boy clutching stolen bread. Klaus wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to bolt, to drop the food and flee. But his legs would not move. He stood there trembling, waiting for the inevitable. He had heard stories about what happened to thieves. Would they shoot him? Beat him? Throw him in a prison cell to starve anyway? But Sergeant Parker did not reach for his weapon. He did not shout. He simply stood there, studying the boy with eyes that had seen Normandy, that had witnessed the liberation of concentration camps, that had stared into the true face of human suffering. "How old are you, kid?" Parker asked in English. Klaus did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was not angry. It was something else. something Klaus had not heard in a very long time. It was almost gentle. Zane, Klaus whispered. Then, remembering the few English words he had picked up from listening to soldiers, he held up 10 fingers. 10. Parker let out a long breath. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking every one of his 32 years and then some. The sergeant took a step forward and Klaus flinched, but Parker stopped. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Easy, kid. Easy. Parker looked around the tent, then back at the boy. He saw the hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes, the clothes that hung on Klaus's frame like rags on a scarecrow. He saw the desperate fear mixed with determination, the look of someone who had been forced to choose between dignity and survival, and had chosen life. The sergeant made a decision. He walked slowly to one of the tables and picked up a metal plate. Klaus watched, confused, as Parker began loading it with food. Eggs, bacon, bread with butter. A cup of milk, real milk. Parker held it out to the boy. Here, he said simply. Klaus stared at the plate. It made no sense. This was a trick. It had to be a trick. But then Parker set the plate down on a nearby crate and stepped back, giving the boy space. He gestured to the food, then to his own mouth, the universal sign for eating. Klaus did not need to be told twice. He fell on that food like a starving animal, which in truth he was. He shoved eggs into his mouth with his bare hands, not caring about manners or dignity. He tore at the bread, nearly choking in his haste. Tears streamed down his dirty face, though whether from the food or the unexpected kindness even Klaus could not say. Parker watched in silence. He had a son back home. Tommy Parker was 8 years old, just 2 years younger than this German boy. When James Parker looked at Klaus Müller, he did not see an enemy. He saw a child, just a child who had done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. When Klaus had finished, he looked up at the sergeant with eyes full of confusion and gratitude and lingering fear. Parker smiled, a small, sad smile, and then he did something that would change both their lives. He pointed to Klaus, then to the kitchen, then made a sweeping gesture with his hands. He picked up a wooden spoon and held it out to the boy. Klaus understood. The American was offering him something. Not just food, but work. A purpose. A reason to come back. You help, Parker said slowly, gesturing around the kitchen. You work. I give food. Understand? Klaus did not speak English well, but he understood survival. He understood opportunity. He nodded frantically. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And so began one of the most unlikely partnerships of the war. Sergeant Parker did not clear his decision with the officers. He simply presented Klaus the next morning as his new kitchen assistant. There were raised eyebrows, certainly. A few officers questioned the wisdom of bringing a German civilian, even a child, into the base. But Parker had a reputation as a solid, dependable man. He had fought at Kasserine Pass, had earned his stripes through blood and courage. If Parker vouched for the kid, most men were willing to let it slide. Besides, they had bigger problems to worry about. The war was entering its final days, but those final days were proving to be some of the bloodiest. Every day brought news of more casualties, more towns taken, more resistance overcome. A skinny German boy helping in the kitchen was hardly a priority concern. Klaus proved himself quickly. He worked like someone possessed, scrubbing pots until they gleamed, peeling potatoes with meticulous care, hauling water and firewood without complaint. He was always early, always eager, always grateful. The other soldiers began to warm to him. They taught him English words, laughing at his pronunciation. They showed him card games, shared their cigarettes even though he was too young to smoke, treated him with a rough affection that was the closest thing to kindness Klaus had known in years. But it was with Sergeant Parker that Klaus formed the deepest bond. Parker took the boy under his wing in a way that surprised even himself. He made sure Klaus ate at every meal, even giving up portions of his own rations when supplies ran tight. He found Klaus a clean uniform shirt, many sizes too large but warm. He taught the boy to read English using old comic books and letters from home. In the evenings, when the work was done and the darkness pressed in, Parker would sometimes talk about his own son, about his farm in Indiana, about the life he was fighting to return to, and Klaus, in his broken English mixed with German, would talk about his life before, about his father who loved to whittle wooden toys, about his mother who sang while she cooked, about the apartment they had lived in, with its view of the Frankfurt Cathedral before the bombs came and turned the world into ash. The war did not stop for their friendship. All around them, the Third Reich crumbled. News came of Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed the unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Klaus was in the kitchen when the news arrived. He watched as the American soldiers erupted in celebration, hugging each other, crying, shouting with joy. They had survived. They were going home. But Klaus had no home to go to. He stood there, surrounded by jubilant soldiers, and felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. What would happen to him now? Would the Americans leave? Would he be cast back into the ruins alone again? Sergeant Parker found him that evening, sitting outside the kitchen tent, staring at nothing. "Kid," Parker said, sitting down beside him with a grunt. "We need to talk." Klaus looked up at him with frightened eyes. "You go? You go America?" Parker nodded slowly. "Yeah, eventually. Orders say we'll be here for a few more months, helping with the reconstruction effort. But then, yeah, I go home." "I understand," Klaus said quietly. He had known this was coming. Everything good in his life ended eventually. Why should this be different? But Parker was not finished. The sergeant pulled out a worn photograph from his breast pocket and showed it to Klaus. It was a picture of a woman and a young boy standing in front of a white farmhouse. Parker's wife, Mary, and his son, Tommy. "My family," Parker said. "I've been writing to Mary, about you, about everything." Klaus did not understand where this was going. Parker took a deep breath. "I've been making inquiries, Klaus, about your situation. We've tried to find any relatives, anyone who could take you in. But there's no one, is there? Your father is officially listed as missing, presumed dead. Your mother died in the bombing. No grandparents, no uncles or aunts that we can locate." Klaus shook his head. "No, no one." Parker nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. "Here's the thing, kid. There's a lot of orphans like you right now. Germany's full of them. The occupation forces are setting up orphanages, trying to figure out what to do with all these children. Some will get adopted by German families eventually. Some won't. It's going to be hard, Klaus. Really hard." Klaus felt his throat tighten. He had known this, had tried not to think about it. Back to the streets, back to scrounging and stealing and being alone. "But," Parker continued, and there was something different in his voice now, something that made Klaus look up. "But there might be another way." The sergeant met the boy's eyes. "I've been in touch with the Red Cross, with the military administration, with people who handle these things. It's complicated, Klaus. It's going to take time, probably years. There's paperwork and laws and 1,000 things that have to happen. But Mary and we've been talking and we want to try something." Klaus hardly dared to breathe. "We want to bring you to America, Klaus. We want to adopt you, make you part of our family. If you want that. If you'd be willing to leave Germany and start over in Indiana." The boy stared at the sergeant, unable to process the words. America. Family. Adoption. These were concepts so far beyond his current reality that they seemed like fairy tales. You want me?" Klaus whispered. Parker's eyes grew wet, and he put a large, calloused hand on the boy's thin shoulder. "Yeah, kid. We want you. You've got heart. You're a survivor. You've been through hell and you're still standing. Tommy needs a big brother. And I think, maybe, you need a family again." Klaus broke. The tears he had held back for so long, the grief and fear and desperate hope, it all came pouring out. He threw his arms around Sergeant Parker and sobbed into the man's uniform. And Parker held him, this enemy child who had become his son in all but name, and let him cry. The process was indeed long and complicated. The United States military and the nascent occupation government were not set up for American soldiers to adopt German war orphans. There were concerns about propaganda, about precedent, about the appropriateness of fraternization with the enemy population. But Parker was persistent. He was a decorated veteran, a man of unimpeachable character. He had letters of recommendation from his commanding officers, testimonials from fellow soldiers who had witnessed his care for the boy. More importantly, he had connections. A captain who owed Parker his life after the sergeant had dragged him from a burning tank at Remagen. A colonel who had served with Parker's father in the First World War. These men pulled strings, called in favors, pushed paperwork through channels. The months dragged on. The summer of 1945 gave way to autumn, and autumn to winter. Klaus remained at the base, working in the kitchen, learning English, growing stronger as regular meals put weight on his bones. Parker stayed in Germany longer than many of his fellow soldiers, volunteering for the occupation duty that others were eager to leave behind. On a cold morning in February of 1946, nearly a year after Klaus had first stolen food from the kitchen tent, a telegram arrived. The adoption had been approved. Klaus Müller was legally authorized to emigrate to the United States as the adopted son of Sergeant James and Mary Parker. Klaus was going home. Not to the Frankfurt that was, but to a new home across an ocean in a place called Indiana. The day Klaus and Parker left Germany was gray and wet. They drove through the ruins of Frankfurt one last time, and Klaus pressed his face to the window of the military truck watching the broken city slide past. This had been his home, the place where he was born, where his parents had lived and died. Part of him would always remain here, buried in the rubble with his mother, lost on the Eastern Front with his father. But another part of him, the part that had survived, the part that had dared to hope, was ready to begin again. At the port of Bremerhaven, Klaus boarded a military transport ship bound for New York. He stood at the rail as Germany receded into the misty distance, and Sergeant Parker stood beside him, a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You okay, son?" Parker asked. Klaus thought about the question. Was he okay? He had lost everything. His parents, his country, his childhood innocence. The war had taken so much from him that could never be returned. But he had also gained something. He had learned that even in the darkest times, humanity could still flicker to life, that an enemy soldier could see past the uniform and the flag to the person underneath. That kindness was possible even in hell. "I am okay," Klaus said in his accented English. He looked up at the man who had saved his life in more ways than one. "I am going home." The ship's horn blew, a long, mournful sound that echoed across the water. And as the vessel turned westward, toward America, toward the future, Klaus Müller allowed himself something he had not felt in a very long time. The story of Klaus and Sergeant Parker did not end at that port. It was, in many ways, just beginning. Klaus would arrive in Greencastle, Indiana, in March of 1946, where Mary Parker would embrace him with tears streaming down her face, and young Tommy Parker would shyly offer his new brother a baseball glove. Klaus would struggle with English, with American customs, with the nightmares that woke him screaming in the night. But he would also laugh again, play again, learn to be a child again. He would go to school, make friends, eventually graduate from high school. He would work on the Parker farm, learning the rhythms of planting and harvest, the honest work of tending the land. He would never forget Germany, never stop mourning his first parents, but he would build a new life nonetheless. Klaus Müller became Klaus Parker. He served in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, following in the footsteps of his adopted father. He would marry a girl from Indianapolis named Dorothy, have 3 children of his own, and eventually take over the Parker farm when James grew too old to work it. Sergeant James Parker would live to the age of 78, long enough to see his adopted son thrive, to hold his grandchildren, to know that his decision in that kitchen tent in Frankfurt had been the right one. On his deathbed, with Klaus holding his hand, Parker's last words were simple. "I'm proud of you, son. So proud." Klaus would tell his story many times over the years. To his children, to his grandchildren, at veterans gatherings and in schools where teachers asked him to speak about the war. And every time, he would begin the same way. "I was a 10-year-old boy who stole food to survive, and an American soldier caught me and changed my life forever." It was a story about hunger and hope, about enemies becoming family, about the power of one act of kindness to ripple across decades. It was a story about the war, yes, but more than that. It was a story about what comes after war. About reconciliation. About healing. About choosing to see the human being, even when the world tells you to see only the enemy. In the years following the war, thousands of stories like Klaus's played out across Europe. Stories of soldiers who could not turn away from suffering, who saw children in need and chose compassion over hate. These stories did not make the headlines. There were no medals for feeding hungry boys, no monuments erected to the small acts of decency that happened in the shadows of the great battles, but these stories mattered. They mattered to the children who survived because someone cared. They mattered to the soldiers who found their humanity in the ruins of war. They mattered to the families that were built from the ashes of destruction. Klaus Parker would live to the age of 72, passing away in 1997 in the same farmhouse where James and Mary had first welcomed him. At his funeral, his children spoke of his kindness, his strength, his quiet wisdom. They spoke of how he had taught them the importance of compassion, of seeing beyond differences, of never forgetting where you came from while always looking toward where you could go. And they told the story of how their father had once been a starving German boy who stole food from an American base, and how a soldier caught him and made him a kitchen helper. And then, when that soldier could have walked away, when his duty was done and the war was won, he had chosen to do something more. He had chosen to love. That is the story of Klaus Müller and Sergeant James Parker. It is one story among millions, a single thread in the vast tapestry of World War II. But it is a thread worth remembering, worth honoring, worth telling again and again. Because it reminds us that even in the worst of times, even when the world is tearing itself apart, there is still room for grace. There is still space for mercy. There is still the possibility of redemption. The war destroyed cities and nations. It killed millions and scarred generations. But it also revealed something essential about the human spirit, that we are capable of unimaginable cruelty, yes, but also of unimaginable kindness, that a soldier and a boy, enemies by birth, can become father and son by choice. That hunger can lead not just to desperation, but to connection, that in the ruins of Frankfurt, in a kitchen tent surrounded by the wreckage of war, two lives could intersect and change forever. This is their story. This is their legacy, and it endures long after the battles have ended and the soldiers have come home, as a testament to what is possible when we choose to see the humanity in one another, even in war, especially in war, when it matters most.